October 13, 1944. Deep inside the shattered remains of Aachen, Germany. A cellar beneath a medieval stone structure trembles as the artillery barrage continues outside. A German soldier belonging to the 246th Volksgrenadier Division presses his back against a cold, damp stone wall and waits in the darkness. His rifle is leveled at the heavy wooden door leading to the street. He has been trained to defend this choke point, knowing that the Americans must eventually come through that door or through the windows above. He waits for the inevitable silhouette in the doorway, the predictable target that urban combat has always provided. They never come through the door. Instead, the solid stone wall directly behind him violently erupts inward. A deafening blast of pulverized mortar brick and concussive force throws him across the room. Before the blinding dust can even begin to settle, American infantrymen are stepping through the jagged smoking hole in the masonry. They are already inside the room, perfectly aware of its dimensions, having bypassed the street, the door, and the fatal funnel entirely. In the post-war interrogations conducted by Allied intelligence, German prisoners who had survived the apocalyptic urban meat grinders of Stalingrad, Cassino, and Brest repeatedly used a single specific word to describe what the American army did to them in the city of Aachen. That word was unbegreiflich, incomprehensible. They firmly believed that the American tactics violated the established laws of military logic. But they were entirely wrong. What happened in Aachen was perfectly comprehensible. It was simply not war the way the German High Command had been trained to fight it, or the way they expected the Americans to fight it. This was the precise systematic dissection of a fortified city. It was a completely new doctrine of urban warfare forged in the laboratories of American military intelligence, mapped by high-altitude reconnaissance and executed with brutal mechanical efficiency. This is the forensic audit of how the United States Army systematically dismantled the first major German city of the Second World War, the ancient medieval capital of Charlemagne, declared a fortress by Adolf Hitler himself in a matter of 9 days using a single understrength regiment against a heavily entrenched garrison that American intelligence believed numbered nearly 12,000 men. To understand the absolute shock of the German defenders, one must first understand the prevailing military dogma of 1944. Every major army on Earth, the British, the Soviet, the German, and the American, believed that cities were unwinnable death traps for an attacking force. The architectural density of a European city provided the defender with infinite fields of fire, concealed heavily fortified positions, and the ability to turn every rubble-strewn intersection into a killing zone. The catastrophic Soviet losses at Stalingrad and the grueling bloody crawl of the Allied forces through the Italian town of Ortona had proven that urban combat was a war of attrition where the attacker inevitably bled to death in the streets. Armored vehicles were considered useless, highly vulnerable to anti-tank weapons fired from elevated windows. Infantry assaults down long straight avenues were suicidal. The standard operational doctrine dictated that cities should be bypassed, besieged, and starved out, never assaulted directly. But Aachen could not be bypassed. It sat squarely within the Siegfried Line, the massive network of German defensive fortifications known as the Westwall. Its capture was a logistical and psychological necessity for the American First Army as they prepared to push toward the Rhine River. General Courtney Hodges, commanding the First Army, knew that a traditional siege would stall the Allied momentum, giving the German war machine precious time to reconstitute its forces. The Americans had to take the city, and they had to do it quickly. But they refused to do it by throwing thousands of young men into a meat grinder. Instead, they decided to turn the city into a math problem. The American advantage did not begin in the muddy fields outside the city limits, but miles above the European continent in the freezing, unpressurized cockpits of specialized reconnaissance aircraft. Long before the first American infantrymen set foot in the outskirts of Aachen, the entire theater of operations was subjected to the most intensive and sophisticated aerial mapping campaign in human history. The United States Army Air Forces deployed squadrons of Lockheed F-5 Lightnings, a heavily modified unarmed photographic reconnaissance variant of the famous P-38 twin-engine fighter. Stripped of all their heavy machine guns and cannons, these aircraft were painted in a specialized haze blue camouflage and fitted with an array of highly advanced large-format cameras mounted in their specialized noses. Flying at altitudes exceeding 30,000 feet, well above the effective range of standard German anti-aircraft flak, the F-5 pilots flew highly precise overlapping grid patterns across the Rhineland and the Netherlands. The capabilities of these photographic platforms were staggering. In a single sortie, a formation of 5 American reconnaissance aircraft could photograph 3/4 of the entire landmass of Holland in under 1 hour, capturing high-resolution images that revealed incredibly minute details of the terrain below. The resulting hundreds of thousands of aerial photographs were rushed back to Allied intelligence processing centers in England, where legions of skilled photo interpreters, stereoscopists and cartographers scrutinized the images. Using advanced stereoscopic viewers that rendered the 2-dimensional photographs into 3-dimensional topographical landscapes, the analysts mapped every street, every major building, every rail line and every anti-tank ditch in the Aachen sector. They identified the primary defensive belts of the west wall, the concrete pillboxes camouflaged as civilian houses, and the exact dimensions of the medieval city center. This vast trove of overhead intelligence provided the American commanders with an unprecedented macro-level understanding of the battlefield. But the macro level was not enough to win a street fight. To defeat the German garrison, the Americans needed to understand the microgeography of the city better than the men defending it. While the reconnaissance aircraft mapped the city from the stratosphere, the intellectual foundation for the assault was being laid out in a quiet office in Washington, D.C. In January of 1944, the War Department published a seemingly obscure 124-page document titled Field Manual 3150: Attack on a Fortified Area and Combat in Towns. This manual represented a radical quiet revolution in military thought. It completely discarded the suicidal tactics of the First World War and the bloody street fighting techniques of the early 1940s. Field Manual 3150 explicitly instructed American officers that streets were no longer avenues of advance but rather death traps designed by the enemy to funnel troops into pre-sighted machine gun fire. The manual dictated that the advancing infantry must never use the streets, never use the front doors, and never expose themselves to the exterior windows. Instead, the American army was instructed to move through the buildings themselves. They were to fight room by room, floor by floor, moving horizontally and vertically through the very masonry of the city. This tactical concept would become known as mouse holing. The soldiers were trained to use explosive charges, bazookas or heavy hammers, to breach the interior walls separating adjacent row houses or rooms. By blowing a hole through a shared internal wall, an infantry squad could advance down an entire city block without ever stepping foot onto the sidewalk. They could bypass the heavily defended barricades, outflank the German machine gun nests positioned at the intersections, and constantly strike the enemy from unexpected angles. It was a doctrine that required extreme discipline, heavy reliance on high explosives, and an intimate knowledge of the architectural layout of the target structures. The German defenders, who were strictly adhering to their own defensive doctrines centered around controlling the streets and establishing strongpoints at major intersections, were entirely unprepared for an enemy that treated brick and stone walls as meta suggestions. The man tasked with executing this revolutionary doctrine in the shattered streets of Aachen was Lieutenant Colonel Darrell M. Daniel, the commanding officer of the 2nd Battalion 26th Infantry Regiment attached to the legendary 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One. Daniel, a highly analytical tactician from West Point, understood that the chaos of urban combat often caused units to lose their sense of direction, resulting in friendly fire incidents and a complete breakdown of command and control. To prevent this, he implemented a system of absolute spatial control before his men even crossed the railroad embankment that marked the city limits. Using the high-resolution aerial photographs provided by the Air Force's, Daniel and his intelligence staff divided the entire city of Aachen into a highly detailed numbered grid. But they did not simply draw squares on a map. They systematically assigned a unique numerical designation to every single significant building, every factory, every church, and every block of row houses. This exhaustive mapping process essentially transformed the chaotic medieval city of stone into a massive, highly organized chessboard. Every squad leader and platoon commander in the 2nd Battalion was issued a copy of this master grid map. This meant that during the heat of battle, a squad pinned down by sniper fire did not need to scream confused directions over the radio. They simply called their command post and identified the exact building number they were occupying and the exact building number the enemy fire was originating from. This allowed the Battalion Fire Direction Center to coordinate artillery strikes, mortar barrages, and direct tank fire with terrifying speed and millimeter precision, avoiding the friendly infantry while annihilating the German strongpoints. The grid system completely neutralized the confusion of the urban battlefield, allowing Daniel to orchestrate the movement of his companies like a master conductor, ensuring that the American pressure was relentless, coordinated, and overwhelmingly lethal. However, the grid map only told the American forces what the buildings looked like from the outside. The ultimate secret to the American success, the reason the German prisoners were utterly baffled by the American ability to know the exact room layouts before entering a building, lay in a highly classified intelligence operation that unfolded in the very first days of the battle. As the outer edges of Aachen fell to the advancing American infantry, specialized intelligence gathering teams attached to the First Army moved into the rubble right behind the combat troops. Among these teams was a highly specialized unit operating under the designation HOHTAIM. Attached to this unit was a 46-year-old major, a former civilian academic from Cornell University, recognizable by his wire-rimmed glasses and intellectual demeanor. He was not a combat infantryman, he was an intelligence officer with a specific critical mission. While the riflemen were clearing the cellars, the major and his team bypassed the military targets and headed directly for the bombed-out remains of the Aachen University Library, the municipal offices, and the city engineering departments. They were hunting for paper. In the flooded basements and partially collapsed archives, they found exactly what they were looking for. They recovered the original municipal blueprints of the entire city. They secured the detailed architectural plans for the historical buildings, the layout of the massive underground sewer network, the schematics for the electrical grids, and the blueprints for the subterranean transit and utility tunnels. These were the documents that detailed the nervous system of the city itself. They showed the exact thickness of the load-bearing walls, the locations of the hidden stairwells, the layouts of the interconnected cellars, and the hidden access hatches leading into the sewer system. This intelligence haul was immediately rushed back to the battalion command posts, translated and integrated into the tactical planning. The integration of the municipal blueprints into the combat operations was the final piece of the puzzle. It completely changed the geometry of the battle. When an American infantry squad prepared to assault a fortified block, they did not do so blindly. Their platoon leaders had already consulted the translated blueprints. They knew that the basement of Building 72 connected to the basement of Building 74 through a specific coal chute. They knew that the internal wall separating the third-floor apartments was only single brick thickness, easily defeated by a small charge of C4 explosive. They knew the exact layout of the blind corners and the internal corridors. Armed with this godlike architectural awareness, the American soldiers executed the mouse-holing doctrine with devastating efficiency. A typical assault began with suppressing fire against the exterior of the building. While the Germans braced for a frontal assault at the doors and windows, an American demolition team would quietly maneuver to an adjacent building or an adjoining structural wall. They would place a shaped charge or fire a bazooka directly into the masonry. The explosion would instantly blast a jagged hole through the stone, creating an artificial doorway. Before the dust cleared, the American infantrymen armed with Thompson submachine guns, Browning automatic rifles, and fragmentation grenades would pour through the breach. Because they had studied the blueprints, they knew exactly which way to turn the moment they entered the room. They knew where the stairwell was located, and they knew where the German defenders were most likely hiding. They would clear the room with a massive volume of automatic fire and grenades before the stunned German soldiers even registered that their supposedly impenetrable flank had been breached. The American teams would then immediately set the next explosive charge on the next interior wall, violently repeating the process. They moved like a subterranean mechanized predator, chewing their way through the guts of the city block by block, completely ignoring the heavily defended streets outside. The German soldiers waiting at the barricades with their MH-42 machine guns found themselves constantly outflanked, surrounded, and annihilated from the rear by an enemy that seemed to materialize straight out of the solid stone. The infantry was not fighting alone. To support this relentless subterranean advance, the United States Army employed a weapon of terrifying destructive power in a completely unorthodox manner. The standard heavy artillery piece of the American Army was the M1 155mm howitzer, affectionately known as the Long Tom. Designed to lob massive high-explosive shells weighing nearly 100 pounds over distances exceeding 14 miles, the Long Tom was traditionally positioned far behind the front lines, executing indirect fire missions calculated by complex mathematical formulas. But in the dense urban canyon of Aachen, the standard artillery arc was often blocked by the towering church spires and the multi-story apartment blocks. The American commanders realized that dropping artillery shells onto the roofs of the buildings was ineffective against the deep reinforced cellars where the German troops were heavily entrenched. They needed direct horizontal kinetic energy. In a move that horrified the traditional artillery officers, the heavy 155mm howitzers were dragged directly into the city streets. They were positioned at the intersections, sometimes merely 300 yards away from their intended targets. The heavy guns were depressed to a completely horizontal angle, effectively turning the massive strategic artillery pieces into point-blank tactical battering rams. The implementation of this tactic was incredibly violent. When an infantry squad encountered a fortified building that could not be easily bypassed or destroyed with small explosives, they would fall back to a safe distance and radio the gun crews. The massive 155mm howitzer would fire directly down the narrow city street. At a range of 300 yards, the 95-pound high-explosive shell traveled with such immense flat trajectory velocity that it did not simply explode against the exterior of the building. The kinetic force of the impact allowed the heavy steel casing to penetrate deep into the stone structure before the delayed action fuse detonated the immense payload of TNT inside the confined space. The resulting explosion was catastrophic. It did not just destroy the room, it structurally compromised the entire building, frequently causing the upper floors to completely collapse downward, crushing the German defenders under hundreds of tons of pulverized masonry and timber. The psychological impact of a massive artillery shell screaming straight down a street at eye level, followed by the instantaneous vaporization of a heavy stone building, shattered the morale of the surviving German troops, who realized that absolutely no structure in the city could provide them with safety. While the systematic destruction of the city center was underway, the battle for the high ground overlooking Aachen required a different kind of brutal mechanical courage. The dominant terrain feature controlling the approaches to the city was Observatory Hill, locally known as Crucifix Hill due to the massive cross positioned at its summit. This hill was heavily fortified, heavily mined, and integrated directly into the Siegfried Line defenses. It was honeycombed with reinforced concrete pillboxes, deep communication trenches, and interlocking fields of overlapping machine gun fire. The task of taking this seemingly impregnable position fell to Company C of the 18th Infantry Regiment, commanded by Captain Bobby A. Brown. Brown was a hardened veteran, an incredibly aggressive and deeply experienced combat leader who understood that momentum was the only currency that mattered in an assault against fixed fortifications. On October the 8th, as his company advanced up the steep muddy slopes of the hill, they were immediately pinned down by devastating crossfire from three mutually supporting concrete pillboxes. The American artillery barrage had failed to penetrate the thick reinforced concrete, and the infantry was bleeding out on the exposed slope. Realizing that his entire company would be annihilated if they remained stationary, Captain Brown made a decision of staggering personal bravery. Armed with a pole charge, a massive explosive device fixed to the end of a long stick, and several satchel charges, Brown ordered his men to provide covering fire while he aggressively moved forward completely alone. Running, crawling, and diving through the mud under intense, accurate machine gun fire, Brown managed to reach the blind spot of the first pillbox. He shoved the pole charge directly into the firing embrasure and detonated it, instantly killing the German crew inside and silencing the gun. He did not stop. Covered in mud and debris, he crawled back down the slope, retrieved more explosive charges, and initiated a second solo assault against the next fortified position. As he maneuvered across the torn earth, he was struck by enemy fire but ignored the wound, continuing his advance until he successfully destroyed the second pillbox with another satchel charge. Bleeding and exhausted, he returned to his lines once again, grabbed a final set of explosives, and launched a third desperate attack against the final strongpoint. During this final assault, he was wounded again, but he successfully reached the concrete structure and violently eliminated the final heavy machine gun nest. Even after destroying the three primary pillboxes, Captain Brown refused medical evacuation. He realized that the German forces were forming up for an immediate counterattack. Bleeding from multiple shrapnel and bullet wounds, he physically moved among his exhausted men, repositioning their weapons, distributing ammunition, and organizing the defensive perimeter. When the German counterattack struck, he deliberately exposed himself to enemy fire to draw their attention, allowing his men to successfully repel the assault. Only when the position was absolutely secured and the objective was firmly in American hands did Captain Brown allow himself to be treated for his injuries. He had been wounded an incredible 13 times during the engagement. For his actions on Crucifix Hill he was awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration of the United States. His astonishing courage ensured the tactical encirclement of Aachen, but the psychological toll of the war would haunt him forever. The fierce warrior who had single-handedly dismantled a heavily fortified section of the Siegfried Line would tragically end his life decades later working quietly as a janitor at the United States Military Academy at West Point, his immense sacrifices largely invisible to the young cadets passing him in the halls. The capture of Crucifix Hill effectively sealed the fate of the German garrison inside Aachen. They were now completely surrounded, cut off from all reinforcement and resupply, and subjected to the relentless methodical grinding of the American infantry. The German commander, Colonel Gerhard Wilk, was an experienced officer who understood the grim reality of his situation. He had received direct orders from Adolf Hitler dictating that the city must be held to the last man and that surrender was absolutely forbidden. He had promised his superiors that the defenders of Aachen would emulate the fanatical resistance of the Soviet defenders at Stalingrad, turning the city into a vast graveyard for the American First Army. But the American tactics completely dismantled the German defensive strategy. The traditional German strongpoints located at the major intersections were consistently bypassed, isolated, and destroyed from the rear. The highly effective German anti-tank guns, heavily camouflaged and positioned to cover the long avenues, were rendered completely useless because the American armor refused to advance down the center of the streets. The heavy American Sherman tanks and tank destroyers essentially acted as heavily armored mobile pillboxes, advancing slowly and carefully, keeping their vulnerable flanks protected by the infantry clearing the buildings around them. When the infantry encountered heavy resistance, they would use the building numbering system to instantly call forward the armor. A Sherman tank would slowly creep around a corner, elevate its 75mm main gun and fire directly into the specific window designated by the infantry before immediately reversing back into hard cover. It was a perfectly synchronized lethal dance between the infantry, the armor, and the heavy artillery. The logistics of supplying this urban assault were incredibly complex. The American quartermasters essentially had to build a fully functioning supply chain operating entirely within the ruins of the city. The primary method of communication between the advancing infantry platoons and the battalion command posts relied heavily on physical field telephone wire. Because radio signals were frequently blocked or distorted by the heavy stone buildings and the massive amounts of metallic debris, the Signal Corps troops were forced to lay miles of heavy communication wire directly through the rubble. These wiremen performed one of the most dangerous jobs in the city, constantly exposing themselves to sniper fire to repair lines that were continually severed by artillery shrapnel and falling masonry. They strung the wire through the basements, up the collapsed stairwells, and across the destroyed rooftops, ensuring that the vital link between the frontline squads and the fire direction centers remained intact. The delivery of ammunition rations and medical supplies was equally hazardous. Standard heavy transport trucks could not navigate the massive craters and the mountains of rubble choking the streets. The quartermasters relied heavily on the nimble four-wheel drive Willys jeeps, frequently loading them far beyond their intended capacity with crates of high explosives, bazooka rockets, and small arms ammunition. These small vehicles, driven by incredibly brave supply clerks, navigated the shattered urban landscape under constant harassment fire, delivering the crucial materials exactly where they were needed. The American supply system was vast, flexible, and heavily motorized, standing in stark contrast to the rapidly disintegrating logistical situation of the German defenders, who were soon reduced to scavenging ammunition from the dead and rationing their dwindling supplies of food and clean water. By October 20, the German garrison was compressed into a tiny pocket in the very center of the ruined city. The American artillery barrage had intensified, reducing entire city blocks to pulverized dust. The relentless pressure of the mouse-holing infantry attacks, the point-blank destruction caused by the 155mm howitzers, and the total lack of reinforcement finally shattered the fanatical resolve of the German defenders. On October 21, Colonel Wilk, realizing that further resistance was completely futile and would only result in the absolute annihilation of his remaining men, defied the direct orders of Adolf Hitler and formally surrendered the city to the American forces. As the exhausted, battered German prisoners were marched out of their subterranean bunkers and into the captivity of the Allied forces, they stared in absolute disbelief at the American soldiers. They had expected to inflict massive casualties upon the attackers. They had believed that the dense urban terrain, the thick medieval walls, and the highly engineered concrete bunkers of the West Wall would provide an impenetrable shield against the American advance. Instead, they had been systematically dissected, entirely outmaneuvered, and violently crushed by an army that approached urban combat not as a chaotic street brawl but as a highly calculated engineering problem. The Wort Unbegreiflich echoed through the interrogation centers, not out of ignorance but out of profound shock. The Germans simply could not process the fact that the United States Army had utilized high-altitude aerial photography, captured municipal blueprints, structural analysis, point-blank heavy artillery, and mathematically precise grid coordinates to completely rewrite the established rules of warfare. The Battle of Aachen was not won by simply throwing more men into the meat grinder. It was won by an absolute mastery of intelligence, an unyielding commitment to technological integration, and a profound understanding that the key to conquering a city of stone was not to fight for the streets but to ruthlessly and systematically erase the very architecture that the enemy relied upon for survival. The blueprints had been stolen, the geometry had been calculated, and the walls had been shattered, ensuring that the first German city to fall would serve as a terrifying blueprint for the apocalyptic battles that lay ahead.